Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Today's guest is a former Connecticut state senator and also a former candidate for lieutenant governor. And he also happens to be perhaps the nicest person on the planet, Joe Markley. Welcome to the show.
How do you know me well enough to think I'm the nicest person on the planet, Michael?
Oh, you're giving away the secrets here. I've heard you
Okay.
for years on the Todd Feinberg show. Plus, I've talked to you, and you're a very friendly guy. Now, it could be all an act. You might be a sociopath, and I don't know it, but I'm going to go by my own interaction with you so far, and that's where I come to my conclusion.
Well, that's a very sweet thing to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I wanted to have you on today because, as far as I know, you identify as a conservative, and I am the spokesperson for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut. And I wanted to have a discussion about the differences between conservatism and libertarianism. Now, obviously, these are umbrella terms, and just because one happens to be labeled under one of the two umbrellas doesn't mean that it implies agreement with everything that anybody who's ever called themselves that term believes. But I will say that to me, a libertarian is somebody who believes that the purpose of the government is to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizenry, and that the citizens ought to be free to do whatever they want so long as they don't obstruct or interfere with the rights of other people to do the same. So with that as the definition of a libertarian, how would you define conservatism?
Well, first of all, I'd say obviously I don't disagree with the statement you just made as a goal, as a political goal. I agree with it completely, and this is why when I've had this conversation, I frequently have had it in context of occasional differences in opinion between myself and my friend Senator Rob Sampson. Rob and I agree on almost everything, but when we do disagree, it's because he has more of a commitment to the idea that let's say that we have to change things to get to the point that you're discussing, where government confines its duties to those essential functions. And I say I'm not against changing things, but I think that some things maybe don't need to be changed immediately or don't need to be changed yet. And in that sense, that is definitely conservatism. There's a kind of a presupposition that what exists needs to be demonstrated that what exists must be removed before we remove it. Do you know that this Chesterton's fence? Do you know that?
No, I'm
Okay,
unfamiliar.
well, I'll say very quickly. G.K. Chesterton, I say to you and I say to anyone listening to this, is one of the most delightful and entertaining writers of the 20th century, and was a great conservative, not a libertarian. And he said, if you're walking across a field and you find a fence, you might say, what's this fence doing here? It's not doing anyone any good at all. Let's take this fence down. But he said, before you take that fence down, you better find out why it was put up in the first place and make sure that, in fact, it isn't performing some function that you don't understand. I'm in the middle right now of reading a long 3 volumes on the French Revolution, very fascinating. And of course, one can't help but be sympathetic to the causes of the French, to the cause of the French Revolution, to the desire for liberty, to the desire to break down a corrupt system. But the problem was people who were driven ideologically to go further and further in destroying what existed. And always in this kind of undertaking, and the history of the Soviet Union is the same thing, the history of China under Mao, you start by saying, let's get rid of these obvious offenses, and the next thing you're doing, you say, no, we can't really have liberty until we rip the whole old system up root and branch, to the point that in France, of course, they did away with the week, they renamed the months, they felt like they had to start from scratch. Now, I don't accuse you of that, much less Senator Sampson, but I think that is where you start to get into saying, okay, I'm all for liberty and I'm all for getting government out of the way, but I think we got to look at it a little bit in a case-by-case basis.
So basically, it's the argument from Edmund Burke. right? That you don't
Yes,
want to
it's
just
very much
rip the
part.
structures of society down. They're there for a reason, and therefore we want to keep them. I would just say, in regards to the French Revolution, that part of the problem is philosophy, right? It's not just that they ripped everything down; it's what they attempted to replace it with. And when the revolution fell into the hands of Robespierre, you now had Rousseau, and his ideas were predominant. And those were very different ideas from what launched the American Revolution, for instance.
Hey, I'm glad you said that, and that's exactly right. And one thing I'd say about the American Revolution is that it wasn't really a revolution. One might almost say it was a revolt. It was not an attempt to remake society. It just the opposite. I think that the colonists felt that they had already functioned for more than a century, basically as an independent society in different ways in different states, and they had developed something that was working, and they wanted to preserve. And suddenly they felt the heavy hand of the British coming in and saying, "We're going to make these decisions for you on taxation, but on other things as well." And it was really I think what motivates a lot of people on the conservative side in politics today. Their motto might have been, "Leave us alone." We don't need to change this society. The French Revolution, that was a real revolution. And
Yeah.
again, it didn't necessarily start out that way. But as often happens in these cases, it's driven, the radicals have a way of always getting first to the position. And once you get people in this mindset, it's hard for them to say, maybe it would make sense to hang on to the king a little bit longer. Well, they don't want to hear it anymore.
So I've arbitrarily designated 4 subjects that I think conservatives and libertarians would disagree on.
Okay.
And hopefully you're going to take the counterpoint. If you agree with me, then we'll just skip that particular issue.
Okay.
But the 4 things that I've come to are: 1, qualified immunity.
Yeah.
Conservatives seem to, at least in Connecticut, protect qualified immunity. They argue that it should have never been repealed, that it needs to be in place, whereas libertarians would say, no, qualified immunity needs to go. Then there's zoning. Conservatives, again, in Connecticut, are big on local zoning. They want to say, preserve the character of the town or the neighborhood. The war on drugs is another issue. It was, well, I don't want to say it was started by Nixon. I mean, ultimately drugs were, the laws started to come in 1914,
That's
but
right.
Nixon was the first to use the term, and Reagan, of course, ramped it up. And let's get to this guy in a second. What's the chairman of Ben Proto? I'll tell you about him in a second. Then immigration. Conservatives tend to be for more closed borders, not necessarily opposed to immigration, but more restrictions on immigrations than what libertarians would allow. So those are the 4 issues that I've chosen. Are you on what I would say the conservative side with these issues?
Yeah, I could take the counter side on all of those with different, with a certain amount of nuance, but we'll get to it as we go along.
Okay, so but I want to just tell you, Ben Proto, I questioned him once. He was on our mutual friend Todd Feinberg's
Yeah.
show, and I was able to ask him why. I asked him, why would we ever trust Republicans to limit the size of government? Because he had said we need to keep the government within the bounds set forth in the original documents. And he also said, as those original documents say, we're a government for the people, by the people. And I told him, well, first of all, that's not in the founding documents. It's in the Gettysburg Address. But secondly, and I pointed specifically to qualified immunity and the war on drugs. And the reason, and he defended them, but the reason that I pointed to those 2 things is because qualified immunity was a judicial creation. 1967, the Warren Court created qualified immunity. It wasn't a legislative act, it was a judicial act. Now, conservatives are supposed to be strict constructionists and opposed to judicial activism. But in the case of qualified immunity, they defend it because they happen to like the outcome. And Ben Proto said to me, well, sometimes judicial creations are good things. So, I mean, to me, that's just the height of hypocrisy. I once read that the best way you can tell if you're upholding a good standard of interpretation of the Constitution is if you sometimes have to go against your preference. And I heard
Mhm.
Antonin Scalia once say that he is opposed to flag burning, but it nonetheless is protected by the First Amendment. So, with that said, make the case for me for qualified immunity from a conservative perspective.
Well, of the four of them, I felt all along you were most likely to mop the floor with me on this one. And partly because I wasn't there for the fight as a legislator, so I wasn't I wasn't having to make speeches about it and think about it as deeply as I would if I were. And in fact, I didn't know that it was a judicial creation. So you already have the drop on me there. But one thing I'd say about it is part of the argument about this is, well, here's the first thing I'd say about qualified immunity. I would probably object to the bill on principle on the fact that it removes qualified immunity only from police officers and not from all the other municipal employees. And in that sense, anyone that's arguing this on principle, you'd say, well, why have we picked out police officers? Well, if you say, because that's where the problem is, that's not really an argument for principle anymore.
No,
that's
it's not.
Yeah.
By the way, I agree with you. I would get rid of it for everybody.
Yeah. And I don't even know that. Well, let me ask you if you think it would be fair to say, we're going to make a change. It's a change in the right direction, but we're only going to do it so it falls on one group of public employees and all the others are left off. I think that in itself is probably an improper action. It's like saying, let's have equality of hiring, but we're only going to do it in the sanitation department.
Sure, and you're of course referring to the specific bill that was adopted here in Connecticut, which I haven't read, and I'm sure that if I know Democrats, like I think I know Democrats, they probably slipped a lot of things in there that I wouldn't like. But as an up and down principle, I would say this. Everybody pays taxes, right? So if we were to come along and say we need to cut taxes for this group, I'm all for it because it moves us toward liberties. Now, some people would say, well, it's unfair because everybody's not getting a tax cut. But should we be prevented from doing the right thing in one instance because we can't apply it to everybody? And I would say, no, we should do the right thing. So if that were the only consideration,
would you favor if we didn't have religious liberty, that we only give it to Catholics?
If we had no liberty at all,
yeah,
at all, and then I would say, sure, let's open the door to liberty and give it to that one group. I hopefully would never be faced with such a thing. I mean, I think that'd be ridiculous. But nonetheless, yes, I think that if you move toward liberty, it's always a good thing, and moving away from liberty is always a bad thing.
Well, Michael, that's one of the most unfortunate things about politics is that as much as you want there not to be a slippery slope, as much as you want to be able to stand somewhere and say there's no, this is it. It really doesn't work that way. And one reason it doesn't work that way, well, two reasons it doesn't work that way, you've kind of touched on. One is, in the end, you vote on actual bills. You don't vote on principles. Sure. So no matter what you think about the principle, you look at the actual bill and say, either this doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it does it in the wrong way, it does it unfairly. And I'd say the second thing I'd say about it is, it's to say, I would always take the movement towards liberty. Again, I think I could come up with I didn't get you with the religious liberty one, but I think I could come up with one where you'd say you wouldn't support a tax break in this case because the tax break would be inherently unjust. I mean, let's say
an example.
Every registered Democrat in the state of Connecticut is going to get $500 off their property taxes. But you say, well, hey, it's a good thing. At least some people are getting a tax break.
In that case, I might be opposed to it because of the political.
Well,
because of the political thing. I don't know. I haven't given it a lot of thought.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, but here's the thing. Suppose they had proposed that. But let's go to it. Let's use that as the example. Suppose they said all Democrats should get a tax cut. I would say, you know what? I think taxation is wrong, period. Let's extend it. Let's extend it to everybody. Let everybody get a tax cut. But that's not what the Republicans in the state did with qualified immunity. Had they taken your line and said, okay, I agree in principle that this is a judicial creation. The court had no business making this law. Let's get rid of it in its entirety. Then I would respect them. But they didn't do that. What they argued for was you shouldn't be repealing any aspects of qualified immunity. So they're not arguing it based on principle. They're doing it, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, but as a kick to the police unions, who happens to be the union that the Republicans are beholden to.
Well, and as an attack on the police officers, which happen to be the groups that the Democrats want to attack. The reason it doesn't extend to everybody is because it would have to extend to school teachers, right?
Sure, I agree.
The school teachers would who are basically the Democratic Party in Connecticut is a subsidiary of the school teachers union.
Yeah.
So they're not going to do that. Let's talk about it as it happened, because I would have voted for it. I'm sure. I don't doubt that if I'd been sitting there in the chamber, I would have voted. I would have voted with the rest of the Republicans against the change. I think, I think that to do something like that in hot haste, obviously was a response to George Floyd, to Black Lives Matter, to all the things that were going on all over in the country. The police officers in Connecticut, who had not knelt on anybody's neck, right, feel like they're under attack like everybody else in the country. And they turn to the legislature and say, do you have to put your knee on my neck effectively? Do you have to single me out of all public employees in the state of Connecticut who's done nothing wrong, and take away a protection which protects my family, which protects my home, which protects my livelihood, and so forth. And if you tell me it's a meaningful protection, because after all, part of that debate was to say, yet they don't have immunity, even it's qualified immunity. So if in fact they have performed something which is clearly illegal, which is clearly unreasonable, they can be personally liable. So you're saying you're going to take this away, which is kind of in a gray area as to how much protection it was going to do anyways. And you're doing it really not because you think that this is going to change anything that's happening in the law, but because radicals within the Connecticut legislature are determined to do something to get at police officers. I'd say maybe the police officers at this moment deserve defense. And the result, there's been an explosion of disorder since, I don't say it's because, by no means did I say it's because of qualified immunity, but there's been an explosion of disorder nationally since the days of the Black Lives Matter movement. And part of that is because policemen have felt like, okay, if they don't want me out there proactively doing the things that we've been doing in the past, then I'm not going to do it anymore. Why should I stick my neck out when the people aren't with me? And I think that I would have erred, you might say, on the side of standing with the people who are in the breach at that moment.
Okay.
Then put a thumb in their eyes.
So what you did there was you switched the scope of the argument.
Yeah.
Because you switched it to what the consequences were for the police. And what I'm saying is that that's ultimately irrelevant because the law was created inappropriately. Now, you could still have voted against it. If Joe Markley's still in the Senate, Joe Markley can still vote against that bill. What he can do is raise his hand and say, I am not going to vote for a bill that singles out one group of people. You could have made the point that this was an unprincipled law to begin with, and we should get rid of it because of the Constitution. And then we can debate what we should do. Maybe as a legislature, you decide to create qualified immunity as a law, and that would be fine. That's within the scope of legislative authority. But you can make the point. But nobody that I've heard, Ben Proto certainly didn't make it when I asked him, and nobody else I've heard has made the point, yes, this was bad law to begin with. Let's get rid of it in its entirety. That would be principle. That could be something I support. But instead, they just came to the defense of the police based on consequentialist grounds, which are dubious. I mean, look, I know we can go back and forth and say, oh, it's so horrible if you take this away. And then other people are going to say, no, it's not going to cause any harm at all. And it's very difficult to determine, what the effects of a given policy like that are. But the bottom line is it was created in opposition of what most Republicans claim that they want, which is a strict construction of the United States Constitution. But if you have anything else to say about qualified immunity, I'd like to give you the opportunity. But then I want to move to zoning, which is
no, I'm interested in getting through them all. And I'll say just this much more, that you make it. Your analysis of my argument is correct, and yet I think that what do you call it, consequentialist argument? I mean, that goes back to Chesterton's fence. To some extent, you have to say not in a vacuum should there be a fence here or not, but what is going to happen when we remove the fence? And I can't. And you're right that those arguments are always going to be a little more difficult because it's you can say, well, that wasn't a consequence of this; it was a consequence of that. But to walk away from the sense that there are cause and effect is to walk away from a lot.
Well, I can apply the same principle to abortion. Roe v.
Yeah.
Wade was clearly decided wrongly. It was a right read into the Constitution that nobody ever knew was there. Clearly, the founders didn't intend it to be there, but yet it was read in there. But now, 50 years later, if you outlawed abortion nationwide, I think you'd have some very bad consequences for the mothers anyway. I understand there's a debate about the life of the child. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying there would be some negative consequences. Maybe they're outweighed by beneficial consequences. The point is that the consequences don't make it a constitutional right. The original meaning does, and it's the same thing with the qualified immunity.
I agree with you about that completely. And for the first thing to do is not to make the mistake.
Yes.
I guess one of the things I'd say is that once the mistake is made, undoing the mistake is not as easy as simply saying we're going to go back to where we were before, because things have changed in the meantime and a system has grown up around the mistaken policy. So anyway,
so
we
on
can
to
go
zoning.
with that. Let's go on to number 2.
I'll tell you why zoning laws drive me up a wall.
Yeah.
Because I hear conservatives making the argument that zoning laws, local zoning laws, are a protection of property rights. They're clearly not. And they're not a function of capitalism. Now, if you want to make an argument that you're for zoning, go ahead. But it drives me crazy when they say that this is capitalist, this is markets at work. No, it's government interference in the market that's artificially elevating property values. There's no way you get around that. Now, they may like it, they may want it. Hell, I don't think it is, but it might even be right. But it's not capitalism. That's why it really sticks in my craw.
I agree with you about that. I don't know why anyone would say it's property rights. It's property values that people want to defend.
Yes.
If they want to defend property rights, they wouldn't be in favor of zoning. And I will say I have somewhat complicated feelings about zoning. My father was a better libertarian than me, and he was completely against all zoning laws. And he said, if you don't want to have a drop forge factory in your neighborhood, the neighbors ought to get together and buy the piece of property and,
yes,
keep the drop forge out. Yeah. And boy, I understand that. Now, and the other thing I'll say about zoning is, I think it's been a disaster. I think a lot of the problems we have in society, in fact, the very problems that they are now trying to use zoning to correct are problems that zoning created. So now they say, oh, we need this high density housing. We need to have transportation centered. Yeah, well, you made rules about you can't put apartments above buildings and stuff like that. That's why you don't have high density housing. You made rules about every business has to have parking spaces, all these things. Okay. I would come down to this, though. I think I give a great deal of latitude to local communities. I think that's, again, the founders of the country saw this as being, individuals, communities, states, and the nation in that order. And we had, the state of Connecticut, for all the liberty that the founders enshrined in the Constitution, the state of Connecticut paid taxes to the Congregational Church until the 1830s. And I don't think anyone was upset about that. They said that's Connecticut's business. And I actually feel that if a local community wants to make zoning laws, I wouldn't have state zoning laws, I wouldn't have state guidelines, I wouldn't have state expectations. But I'd say if a town, take a town like, well, I don't know, Ridgefield, or some town that's Fall River,
Wolcott.
Someplace like, well, Wolcott, yeah. Wolcott's not quite of the same case. Wolcott's a little more development. But if they want to have 1 acre zoning, I don't really have a problem with that. They're saying this is the nature of the town that we want to have here. We're going to forego a certain amount of development that we'd get otherwise, and we're going to preserve the character of it.
How is that not collectivism, Joe? How is it not? It's collectivism on a local level, but it's collectivism nonetheless, because if everybody in the town doesn't agree, you necessarily are going to have a majority dictating what a property owner can do with his property. How is that not collectivism? How doesn't it violate his property rights? And how does it not go against the conservative claim that they want to protect property rights and that they're for capitalism?
Let me ask you this, to answer that question with a question, if I might. How much control do you think local school systems, local school boards should have over public education? Or would you simply say we shouldn't have public education?
I would say we shouldn't have public education. Yeah. Now, here's another instance. I'm not for what the Democrats in Connecticut are trying to do. They want to turn zoning over to the state.
Yes.
But here's where conservatives lose, because had they made a principled argument and said, you know what? Hell with turning it over to the state. Let's just get rid of it. as a violation of property rights. And matter of fact, let's look at some other violations of property rights. For instance, minimum wage, when you're interfering in the contracts between business owners and employees. Why don't we get rid of that? And you can be consistent and then go extend your argument, similar like we said in qualified immunity, where you're going to not just get rid of it for police, let's get rid of it for everyone. The same thing would go with zoning. Let's get rid of the zoning laws, but let's get rid of them at the state level, or not allow them at the state level, and let's implement some more property rights. But conservatives don't do that. Instead, they fight tooth and nail. We've got to have local zoning, and then they go to make the silly argument that it's a function of markets, and if you don't like it, then you can move someone else. That's how markets work.
I don't care what argument they make. Again, that's not an argument that I would make.
Yeah.
The question is, and this does come around to the difference between a libertarian and conservative. I think part of it would be, part of it becomes like concern about preserving things that need to be preserved. I'm not sure zoning is one of those, but the other is practicality. And this is certainly a difference in politics between libertarians and conservatives. I spoke, I guess it was 4 years ago, to the Libertarian Party convention here in Connecticut, at the invitation of, so at that point, some friendly people that were in charge of it. And I said, you got to ask yourself, why am I standing here on my side instead of being on your side? And I said, I'm glad you're out. I'm not here to come and tell you ought to become Republicans, because I'm really not sure. I'm not sure. I think there's a lot to be said for being a libertarian, and maybe in the great scheme of things, people will look back and say that was the way to go. But what I found is that the complete focus on ideology has made it difficult to hold the movement together. I don't know what your experience has been so far in the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, but a little bit like the French Revolution, there often is this kind of like, you're watering down the principles, and
I agree.
You have to take.
And I agree that's a problem.
And the second problem is you become you have to sell something politically, which nobody is looking to buy. The constituency for having no zoning laws is basically the membership of the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, and not too much more. God bless them, right?
But no one's making the argument.
Yeah,
no
but
one's
if they
explaining.
if they made the argument, it would, if the argument were like this, the response, if you ran, would be devastating. And the response would be one that the average person is going to be susceptible to, which is, do you want to drop Forge factory next to your home? Now that's a straw man. The thing is, when they say stuff like that, most businesses are not going to go. It's just not profitable to go inject themselves into some local community where, you have barbecues in the backyard, and it's a tight knit, family centered community. No one wants to come and interfere with that. Not usually. Who wants to put a strip club, for instance, in Wethersfield, where I grew up? Like you're not going to. It's not entirely a straw man to this effect. I mentioned my father before. He had a small manufacturing business. He bought a building that was already a business in a small neighborhood. The business grew, and he went back to zoning and said, I have to build a addition. And of course, at that point, they said, no, we're not going to let you build the addition. And he said, well, I was already here. I've already been, I'm prospering. I'm hiring people,
Sure.
Et cetera. No, he had to sell the factory and move out. He actually moved out of town. So they lost the revenue altogether. It happens. And my point isn't that it's a good argument to say they're going to put a drop Forge factory next to you, or that it's a true argument. But let's say it's a good argument politically. It would be something that the average voter would say, what? They're going to do away with these rules, which really, the average voter does not wake up and think that zoning is a problem. He thinks taxes are a problem. He thinks crime is a problem.
People that can't afford houses might think it's a problem.
They don't know that it's their problem. They don't understand that that's their problem. Now, again, you're right to say that's why we have to raise the issues and educate people. And I think that's what that's why I like the Libertarian Party, because it's out there beating this drum, but it's not a drum that's gonna elect legislators next year.
Well, maybe that's true.
If you're a Republican, if you're in a party, if you're actually in a situation where you're saying, I'm trying to do something here, saying, well, you got to stand up for something that no one cares about, no one's going to agree with you on. I say, I could do that once in a while, but I'm not going to do it. I can't do it day in and day out, or nothing's going to happen.
Sure. What I find interesting with Republicans and conservatives particularly is I hear them praise frequently. I've heard them on the Todd Show, Rush Limbaugh,
Yeah,
various conservative outlets. Milton Friedman, what a great economist. Thomas Sowell, Walter
yeah,
Williams, they're wonderful, awesome. Then let's go look and see what they say about zoning.
yeah,
In a host of other issues as well, by the way. But it's just, and this is, I think, where it's problematic, right? Well, I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit because I want to make this point. So
yeah,
far, we've only discussed two issues. The other two I want to discuss are immigration and the war on drugs, right? So conservatives are supposed to be the constitutional party, right? The party of small government, capitalism, property rights. Now, very distrustful of government. Now, let's look at the four areas that I brought up where they're on the other side of these liberty-based arguments: qualified immunity, zoning, the war on drugs, and immigration. Now, what do all four of those things have in common? And I'm not saying this is the motivation. I'm just saying it's there, right? All four of those things disproportionately impact minorities. The minorities who are disproportionately affected by the police, the minorities who are priced out of moving into suburbs or can't move into low income housing in the suburbs, minorities that are caught up in the war on drugs, and the minorities who are not allowed to cross the border. Again, I'm not saying that that's the reason. I'm just saying if I'm a black person in America, right, and you have the Republican Party out there touting individual liberty, small government, capitalism, and every time they go against those principles, it disproportionately impacts me, I'm going to be suspicious about it.
Well, it's I would say almost everything government does disproportionately impacts minorities because they're more involved with government, because they tend to be poorer, right? So they're more involved in government programs, they have more vulnerability. The Republicans, when the Democrats want to go after Republicans in front of minority audiences, they don't talk about zoning. They talk about
They do
you
now.
know,
Well, they do now. They have been talking about it now.
yeah.
And
Well, good.
but their answer is
I
to give the power to the state government, which I wouldn't be either. I'm just saying that
yeah,
if I'm a black person and I'm listening to the Republicans make these arguments about the small government, we need to go by the Constitution, you have to be distrustful of government, individual liberty, capitalism, and then they say, okay, capitalism's great, but we don't want freedom of competition when it comes to housing, or we don't want we need to have the police especially protected, or yeah, people have a right to do what they want with their own bodies, but they can't do drugs. That would be horrific. And yes, we're a country that welcomes immigrants and freedom, but that southern border needs to be closed. I'm going to be a bit suspicious about the motivation. And again, I'm not trying to say it is the motivation. I'm just saying that I can understand why somebody would think it would be, especially given the history of the country, which I happen to love, by the way. I'm not a 1619 Project guy. I don't think the country was founded on racism, and I sure as hell don't think it was built by slavery.
yeah. I don't. I think that's a very minor consideration for any minority in the country. What the Republican Party position is on these things. If they don't like Republicans, it's for deeper reasons than that, or for more deeply rooted reasons than that.
Okay, I think we've covered those two. Do you have anything to add about zoning before I move on to immigration? Because that's
No,
going to
that's
be
okay.
fun.
Yeah, but let's okay, go ahead. Let's do immigration then.
Well, immigration, again, to me, is quite simple. Conservatives are against judicial activism. Therefore, the original meaning of the United States Constitution, the powers delegated to Congress are in Article 1, Section 8.
Yeah.
Nowhere in the United States Constitution is the federal government granted authority over immigration. Simply does not exist. In 1800, James Madison wrote a very powerful paper about how the federal government has no power over immigration. He was, the father of the Constitution. If you listen to the Constitutional Convention debates, it's very quiet about immigration. It was brought up very briefly, and the one person who was sort of opposed to it was blasted. And the whole idea back then was to bring people into the country. So if the Constitution doesn't grant the authority to pass immigration laws, and I'm for the Constitution, I have to be opposed to federal immigration laws. I mean, it's a simple syllogism, isn't it?
Okay, you go down a road that is interesting, and I'll push you on it too. Which is, do you agree with me that the Constitution does not guarantee the right to bear arms? It only guarantees that the federal government cannot make laws about the right to bear arms.
I
Do you agree with me that I believe this? All 10 amendments to the Constitution, the whole Bill of Rights,
yes,
applies to the federal government. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the states cannot. I believe that the state of Connecticut can't ban firearms because that's protected under our own Constitution.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think a state government.
But here's the thing: that's as originally written. I mean, the First Amendment says Congress shall enact no law. It says nothing about what a state should do. The whole idea was the Bill of Rights was there to limit the new federal government. However, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment was to incorporate the Bill of Rights and apply them to the states. So although it wasn't in the original Constitution did allow for amendments, and we do have the 14th
a Supreme Court decision to say that was the case. However, it wasn't self-evident enough in the 14th Amendment that it applied to all those. The Supreme Court had to come out and say that
it does say that every citizen of the state will have equal liberty in the 14th Amendment, or something to that effect. I believe.
Yeah, but that means that if one person can't own a gun, the other person can't.
No. I agree, but the problem is I'm not informed enough about the 14th Amendment. I just know that that's how the Bill of Rights was incorporated to apply to the states. For all I know, it might not. It might have been a mistake to apply it to the states. But as originally written, no, I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't say the Bill of Rights applies to the states.
And I again, this is a point where, as a conservative, I do think it should not apply. That the Constitution wasn't meant to do that. That said, I'm happy that it applies to the states in the effect, and I would not be agitating to say we need to withdraw the protections of the Bill of Rights from individual citizens and only apply it to the Constitution. I guess my point about this is, you say the Constitution is silent about immigration. And I mean, is your argument that it cannot then control immigration, or does it become an issue for the states? Is it up to each state?
Constitutionally, according to the Constitution and according to the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment says any power not delegated to the Constitution is going to be reserved to the states or the people. So it would have to go to the states. And again, I'm not saying that that's an efficacious way to deal with it. What I'm saying is that if we're going to make an argument about originalism when it comes to the Constitution, we can't pick and choose. We can't say, oh, well, I happen to like this, so let's allow it. You have to say, okay, they can't do it. And not only that, but not only is the Constitution silent about immigration, but the Declaration of Independence, which is our real founding document, I mean, that's like our mission statement, refers to the rights of all people, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say the rights only of those who happen to live in a particular jurisdiction. And we also know that originally we had open borders. There wasn't a law passed on immigration. Well, you had the Alien and Sedition Acts, which there was a revolt over. But besides that, the next time you had anything was the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think that was 1870. I want to say 6, but I might be wrong. It was the 1870s. Yeah. I know that. So the country had a rich history of allowing for immigration. The Constitution's silent on it. At least I know James Madison was all for open borders. So I don't know how Republicans get around that. If you claim you're an originalist, be an originalist. You can't claim it when you happen to like it, but when you don't, go the other route, which is what Ben Proto basically said to me when he said, oh, well, sometimes the, judicial creations are good things.
Yeah. I think if you're, this is where I think libertarians go off the rails, which is, if your point is, you can't claim to be an originalist unless you're in favor of open borders. Then you'd say, well, I guess the only people that are originalists are going to be people that don't think we should have any control over the borders at all, which is really just not a
well, that's not exactly true. If you're in a case where you're at war, you could have
but you're saying under normal circumstances,
open borders. Absolutely. I'm saying that's what the Constitution allows. If the gripe is with the Constitution, then take the gripe with the Constitution. This isn't me. I didn't write the document. But there is a document that we claim to go by. And if we're going to go by it, we ought to go by it, not pick and choose the provisions that we happen to like.
The woman you probably don't know named Deb Stevenson, who's a lawyer in Connecticut and really is as strong a constitutionalist as I know. And I love her. We're good friends and get along well. And she's been a kind of a lodestar for me as a legislator. I often thought about, what would Deb say about this? But I said to her at one point, listen, we both want to move in the same direction, but how far in that direction we want to go is something that we might have. We might, if we were lucky enough to ever move in that direction, we might reach the point where we started to argue about it, right? And I would say, as a practical matter, again, listen, I'm not here even to defend Ben Proto, but if Ben Proto says, I like 92% originalism versus what I got from the Democratic Party, I'd say, good, Ben. Well, let's, when we get to that 8%, then we'll part company. But in the meantime, at least we're moving down the same road together. If you want to build a political movement, as soon as the second person is involved in it, you're not going to agree with them on everything. And the attempt to say, and the Libertarian Party is an attempt to say, we're going to be sufficiently ideological. And I say that word with respect, not as an accusation, like ideological. But we're going to be sufficiently ideological that we can walk in lockstep, because we have an absolute clear vision. I don't think that ever is the way that politics ends up working. I think that
no, but you can share principles, Joe. You can share principles. I agree with you. I'm not likely to find someone that, like, for instance, a lot of libertarians they think there should be no such thing as intellectual property. I disagree. A lot of them think there should be no government at all, but rather competing protection agencies. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I think sometimes it borders on the ludicrous. But nonetheless, you can still find principles. And the main thing that bothers me with the Republican or the conservative movement is the claim to certain principles as absolutes, except for, and that's the thing. The Second Amendment is sacrosanct. We absolutely have to have it.
But Michael, your friends who say we should have competing security agencies in order to, would say, you're saying you're for the principle except. And this is one of the things about the world is I'm convinced everyone believes in their heart that they're kind of a moderate, because they say, okay, there's all these people to my left,
not me,
people to their right.
I'm no moderate.
I don't say I'm a moderate politically. I'm a conservative. I'm not saying I'm a moderate, but I feel like I'm not like a crazy whatever, right? And everybody looks over to their one side and says, but those people go too far with it. You would say that the libertarians that say we shouldn't have a state security system are going too far, but they could come back and say,
but I wouldn't say they're going contrary to their claims.
No,
that's what I'm saying. That's the accusation, for lack of a better term, I'm leveling at Republicans.
You're not going contrary to your claims either.
But but conservatives do. When conservatives say that they're pro-capitalism, pro-free markets, pro-property rights, but support zoning, they're going against their claim principle. When they say they're originalists for the Constitution, but are for closed borders, they're going against their principles.
Sounds good. Somebody in the libertarian movement who's more radical than you think that you're going against the principles?
I don't know. It would depend on what the principles were. You understand? But like, for instance, I think taxation is theft, pure and simple.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go against that. I think people should have the right.
No taxation.
Huh?
Would you have no taxation?
Yes, with one caveat, however. I'm an incrementalist in this. I would advocate tax cuts as a means to getting to the point where we would eliminate it altogether. I would argue for the ideal, but I wouldn't argue for it immediately. Similarly, I think that we should get rid of all public schools. I don't think that we could do that tonight, because I think it would cause irreparable damage to all the people that are currently dependent on it. So I would argue the principle and then state out a path to get to there. And so I would do the same thing. So if somebody were to say, you're right about the Constitution not allowing immigration laws, but right now we have such a mess, we couldn't implement that right away, let's move towards it, I might be convinced. I'd be seriously open to the argument. What I'm not open to is somebody who says to me that we cannot have activist judges. We cannot have legislatures going contrary to the Constitution. The Constitution is not a living document. It's a dead document. Oh, wait a second, I don't like this part of it, so we're not going to go by it. That I don't like, and that's what I see coming from conservatives. But Joe, we're down to 15 minutes, well, actually a little bit less, and I want to cover the war on drugs.
Yeah.
Okay. Three reasons I'm opposed to the war on drugs. So let me hear what you say. First of all, war on drugs is unconstitutional. My reasoning for that is nowhere in the federal Constitution is Congress authorized to make laws about drugs. Drugs were legal for the vast majority of the history of this country until 1914 with the Harrison Narcotics Act. And when alcohol was banned on a federal level, it required an amendment, the 18th Amendment. If you were going to ban drugs, you should have done the same thing. That's my first argument.
Okay.
Second argument is purely individual rights. An individual ought to be able to put into his body or her body whatever she sees fit. Doesn't mean you should be allowed to drive around in a car while doing it, because now you're, screwing with other people's lives as well. But if you want to put that stuff into your body, no government, no person has the right to tell you you can't. Finally, the consequences. The war on drugs is not winnable. And it's caused devastating consequences to so many communities, including, by the way, this upsurge in overdoses from fentanyl, which is largely due to the fact that when you go and buy street drugs, you don't know what's in it. You don't know how powerful that is. You don't know the dosage. You're just injecting stuff, sniffing stuff, smoking stuff that you really have no idea what it is, a problem you wouldn't have if it were legal. So what would be the conservative argument to sustain the war on drugs? I don't even know that you support it. So if you don't, then, my bad.
Well, look, again, this is the kind of thing that Rob Sampson and I will disagree about late at night after a couple of drinks, but no drugs, which is what, how far do you go in legalizing and so forth? Okay, but let me take your points one by one.
Okay.
I would tend to agree that the federal government doesn't have authority. Again, I would say the state government does have authority.
I agree.
And the states, and then we had dry states before prohibition
Sure,
took effect.
I agree 100%.
Dry towns in Connecticut until quite recently. I think Easton was maybe the last dry town.
Sure.
And I don't see any problem with that. And that kind of goes around to my idea that
I don't like it, but I do think it's constitutional.
Exactly.
I do think it's constitutional.
That's a decision that could be made at a local level. And you take the state of Utah. The majority of the people of the state of Utah are Mormons. The religion believes you shouldn't drink. If the state wants to be a dry state, I'd say that's fine, but you got to do it through a normal process and so forth. Now, so yeah, I agree with you about the federal government. The personal right and the consequences. I guess I would say that, first of all, that acknowledging that the government had the power, for instance, to ban alcohol, which was in common use at the time that the Constitution was put into effect and so forth. And I don't think anyone said, no, holy smokes, you can't do that.
No, because there was an amendment passed.
No, but when it was happening before, it didn't happen federally. It happened at the local and the state level. It was always seen as something that local government had the right to do. So there was a sense that, again, the communities, which can be coercive, which could be, what did he call it, collectivist, still can have a collective and say
tyranny of the majority, like Madison called them.
Yeah. And if you don't like the state, and if you can't live in the state of Utah because you can't stand the tenets of the Mormon Church, then you can move out of the state of Utah. That would be the argument. Now, how far do you go with the legalization of drugs? I guess one thing I used to say to my nephews, there are things that are called vices, and it doesn't mean that they should necessarily be illegal, and it doesn't mean that they necessarily should be banned or you should be punished for it. But you have to recognize that they're not good for you. And prostitution, gambling, alcohol, drugs, pornography, all these things are considered vices.
Yeah, they're not very admirable things. I would agree.
And the question then becomes, how much role does government have in preventing people from engaging in those activities? And a libertarian would say zero, right?
I would.
A conservative, yeah, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. And I don't even find it an alarming position. A conservative would say, we have a kind of society that's been built around seeing these things as being vices. So prostitution will never be eliminated, has never been eliminated. And I don't know that I'm in favor of tremendous prosecution where we say to the police force, your number one job is to catch the prostitutes and the Johns. By the same token, I don't know that I want to see prostitution legalized. I don't want to see society give it that vote of yes, prostitution is now like anything else. It's like buying a hamburger. You're absolutely entitled to do it. I think that gray area has not been necessarily a bad thing to have exist. Again, you can argue it creates a lot of mischief. So how does gambling exist? Well, gambling exists with payoffs to the police, to the law enforcement authorities, and so forth. It invites a certain amount of organized crime. I'm not sure that legalizing it would get rid of that in the first place. It would be a different kind of, it would be organized crime organized along different lines. I am really, back to Chesterton's fence for one last time. I feel that when somebody says heroin should be legal, well, how legal should it be? If you're going to make it legal, you got to make it legal, right? You're not talking about, I went to my doctor and got a prescription.
No, I'm talking about you can go to a heroin shop and buy it. If like a package store. If somebody wants to sell it, they can.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the question of how many more heroin addicts we have after that happens becomes a consequential question.
Well, how much more alcoholics did we have after the repeal of the 18th Amendment? I think I've actually seen things that have said it dropped, but I think I've seen things that it went up slightly. But either way, it didn't become catastrophic. And one thing for sure we lowered was the murder rate. When they got rid of prohibition, organized crime got out of the liquor business, and the murder rate went way down.
I would say that one difference between alcohol and heroin is alcohol is something that has been generally available in society to everybody for thousands and thousands of years. Even and going into prohibition, it wasn't.
And opium wasn't.
Not like that. Holy smokes! I've never seen opium in my life. I mean, it's not something that's around. Right?
Well, it's also been outlawed your entire life.
Yes, it's been outlawed my entire life. This is part of my point. Is I wouldn't say let's open the door to opium and expect that the result is going to be the same as alcohol, because alcohol is something that people they knew what it was. They had exposure to it.
No, there's no way to know exactly. All I'm saying is that we have very few historical analogies, right? We had alcohol prohibition. We experimented with it. When alcohol was made illegal, we had a lot of the same effects that we have now with the drugs. You had an impure substance that people were drinking. Even the government was spiking it with things.
It was poisoning it.
It was poisoning people, just like you have with the drugs today. Organized crime took over. You had gang wars, murders, all types of things like that. So, I mean, there are similarities. They're not exact, of course, but they're there nonetheless.
I would say if we wanted to look, I would look at this. If we want to look at something carefully before we make a decision like that, I would look at a country like the Netherlands, which went down the road of not only legalizing marijuana a long time ago, but heroin as well.
I think Portugal is a pretty good example too.
Yeah, and I would say we could benefit from whatever's happening there. I know in the Netherlands that they have backtracked at least somewhat on the availability of opioids. I don't know about what this experience has been in Portugal, but my concern again would be that you can say, I don't think anything too bad will happen, and maybe you're right, but I'm concerned about opening the door, and especially to something that's as devastating as that is, because it is truly this. We're not talking about alcohol's bad enough, but
we're out of time just about, but I want you to I want you to go look up. I want you to look up the effects of alcohol and juxtapose them with the effects of opiates.
The difference is we don't have the choice with alcohol. That's a fact of life, and the prohibition proves that it's a fact of life. Opioids are not for the general population,
but they are for a lot of people.
Well, what do you say? Of adults in the country, maybe 60-70% drink alcohol. Certainly not 6%.
No, that's true. But that's true. But I don't think that individual rights should be limited by the amount of people that do it. And certainly a lot of people are affected by it. But Joe, you've been wonderful. Thank you. I hope you will come on again.
Yeah, I'd love to. I enjoyed the conversation.
You've been wonderful. Where can people find you, Joe? Do you have a website, anything?
I don't have, my website is not showing a lot of activity since I'm out of politics. I've got a Facebook page at Joe Markley, and my email address, anyone who wants to get in touch with me, is very easy. Joe@joemarkley.com.
Thank you very much. For now, I'm Michael Liebowitz. This is the Rational Egoist signing out. Remember, like, comment, share, subscribe. Till next time.